We're going to move on to Unit 5, and Unit 5 has to do with radicals, and we're going to start off with graphing square root functions. So when we're graphing square root functions, the three square roots that we're going to focus on are the three easiest ones, 0, 1, and 4. Because we know the square root of 0 is 0, the square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 4 is 2. Now, of course, we could do 9, and we could do 16, and we could keep on going. But the three easiest are 0, 1, and 4. Now remember, there are no negatives. So 0, 0 is our starting point. There's nothing that goes to the left, it only goes to the right. So when we're graphing this, what our graph is going to look like is a point at 0, 0, 1, 1, and then 4, 2. And so that right there is our little curve. Now, our domain is always going to be at our h value, and our h value is always going to be the opposite of inside. So this is for set. Interval is what I'm going to focus on. So it's going to be h to infinity. And then if our a value is positive, it's going to be k to infinity. And if it's going to be negative, it's going to be negative infinity to k. Now, of course, I have the set notation right up here, so you can look at that also. So for our first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my table of values. And what I want are 0, 1, and 4. So what gives me a 0 here is -3. What gives me a 1 is -2. And what gives me a 4 is a 1. When I plug in a -3, -3 plus 3 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. -2 plus 3 is 1. Square root of 1 is 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. Square root of 4 is 2. So now when I have the graph, I have -3, 0. I have -2, 1. And I have 1 and 2. And this right here gives me my graph. Now, when I'm looking at domain and range, I find it easier to look at the graph instead of looking at the formula to find the domain. I see that it starts at -3 and it keeps on going to the right, so -3 to infinity. For the range, right here, it's starting at 0 and it keeps on going up, so it goes up to infinity. Now, for looking at the next one, once again, I'm going to come up with my table of values. And I'm looking for 0, 1, and 4. And what gives me a 0 here is a 2. What gives me a 1 is a 3. And what gives me a 4 is a 6. Now when I plug in a 2, 2 minus 2 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0. -0 plus 1 is 1. When I plug in a 3, 3 minus 2 is 1. Square root of 1 is 1. -1 plus 1 is 0. And when I plug in a 6, 6 minus 2 is 4. Square root of 4 is 2. That would be -2 plus 1, which would give me -1. So when I graph this, I have 2, 1, I have 3, 0, and I have 6, -1. Now notice that in this case, what's happening is it's going down, and that's because of the negative. So my domain stays the same. It's starting at 2, and it goes to infinity. And my range, since it's going down, it's going to be -infinity all the way to 1. And that's the highest point. So looking at letter C, this is a little bit more difficult. I'm going to do my table of values. And since our x value is negative, you're going to notice something. So I'm looking for 0, 1, and 4. What gives me a 0 is a 1. What gives me a 1 is a 0. And what gives me a 4 is a -3. So when I plug in a 1, 1 minus 1 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0 times 2. is 0 minus 3 is negative 3. When I plug in a 0, 1 minus 0 is 1. Square root of 1 is 1 times 2 is 2. Minus 3 is negative 1. When I plug in a negative 3, I get 4. Square root of 4 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 minus 3 is 1. So when I graph this, I have 1 and negative 3. I have 0 and negative 1. And I have negative 3 and positive 1. And notice it's going to the left because of the negative right there. So when I state my domain, I have negative infinity all the way to 1. And when I state my range, what I have is negative 3 all the way to infinity. Now, a couple patterns we should be noticing. One is our HK value is our starting point. So negative 3, 0, negative 3 plus 0. Notice our A value is 1, and we see that it's going up by 1. Here, 2, 1, that's our HK value, opposite, and then the number. And notice that our Y values are going down by 1 because our A value is negative. Opposite. So we have the negative 1, 3, 2, it's going up by 2. So that helps us with our pattern. So when we're looking at letter D, automatically we could do our HK value, negative 1, negative 2. I know my Y values are going down by 1, so it's going to be negative 3 and negative 4. So it just saves me a lot of time. And I already figured out what gave me a 0, and what gives me a 1 would be a 0, and what gives me a 4 would be a 3. So looking at that right there, negative 1, negative 2, 0, negative 3, and 3 and negative 4. And this right here gives me my graph. When I'm looking at my domain, it would be negative 1 to infinity. And when I'm looking at my range, since it's going down, negative infinity all the way to negative 2. Now looking at letter E, we're going to do the same thing. We're looking for our XY values. My HK is 4, 2, so that's what I'm starting off with, 4 and 2. My Y values are going up by 3, so that would be 5 and 8. And what gives me a 1 would be a 5, and what gives me a 4 would be an 8. So with this one right here, just to save space, I'm going to go by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 2, 4, 6, 8. So when I graph this, I have 4, 2, I have 5, 5, and I have 8, 8. And this right here gives me my graph. So my domain, I'm starting at 4. So it's going to be 4 infinity. This point right here tells me domain and range if I have a hard time with the graph. And then I have 2 to infinity. And then for letter F, this one is a little bit more difficult because we've got a B value right here. So I'm going to do my HK value, and my H value is 2. And then it's going up by 1. And what gives me a 1? If you have a hard time with it, what you can do is you can always set it equal to whatever number you want. Subtract the 4. Divide by negative 2, and you get 1.5. So we have 1.5. What gives me a 2? Sorry, what gives me a 4 is a 0. So when I graph this, I have 2, 0, I have 1.51, I have 0, 2, and I see that it's going in the opposite direction because my x is negative. So my domain is going to be negative infinity all the way to 2. And then my range is going to be, it's going to start at 0, and it's going to go to infinity.